Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with part 2 of my November wrap-up. I will link part 1 down below, and I will also put content warnings in the description box as always, as well as all of the people and videos I mention, and a brief overview of some things going on around the world. So the first book I finished in the second part of November was Sisters of the Neversea by Cynthia Leitich Smith. This is a Peter Pan retelling by a Muskogee Creek author, and one of the main characters, Lily, is also Muskogee Creek. And like I said, this is a Peter Pan retelling. We're following Lily and Wendy primarily as our main characters, and in this version of the story they are actually stepsisters. So they have kind of a blended family and they do really get along, but at the beginning of the book there's kind of some tension about who's going to stay with who over the summer and possibly like what's going to happen to their family. So they're sort of fighting right now, even though they love each other very much, because you know that's what siblings do. And they end up meeting Peter Pan and Belle, and Wendy and their baby brother ends up going with Peter Pan to Neverland. And Lily doesn't want to go with them, but she wants to rescue her sister and her little brother, so she goes with them too. And that's kind of where everything starts, and I really loved this. I think this is a really fantastic retelling because I think if you enjoy the original Peter Pan, I think you could still enjoy this one, but also if you don't like the original story, I feel like you could really like the direction that the author takes things in. I loved Lily and Wendy as characters. I love their sister relationship so much. Just the family and the sibling relationships in general in this book are just beautifully developed. And like I said, I also really loved Lily and Wendy individually. Wendy is very like whimsical and kind of a dreamer. She reads a lot of fantasy books, and then Lily is much more practical. She also deals with anxiety, and she reads a lot of like nonfiction, and just like I really liked how they balanced each other out really well, but also how they had common ground. And I just love that in this version they are friends and sisters. I also loved the writing of this book. Like the touch of whimsy it has is very much, it reminds me of the original Peter Pan, but also this definitely has Cynthia Leitich Smith's own flavor to it as well. I thought the story was really interesting. I think some of the choices she makes with the retelling is really interesting, and I think that she really draws on that feeling of darkness in the original. And I also really like the themes about like love and forgiveness, and if people can change, and like acceptance, and just I really loved a lot of the things that this book did, and I was already really enjoying it. But then what really won me over is there were a couple of things about the book that I wasn't sure, like I thought the author was going to go in a particular direction that I tend to find a little less interesting, and then she didn't. She surprised me, and the way she did things I just really enjoyed. I was very impressed, and I gave Sisters of the Neversea 5 stars. I read a different book by this author before that I wasn't a big fan of, but I even said at the time that I think it was more about those characters and that plot than like the author's work as a whole. I thought I would enjoy her other stuff more, so I'm very happy to be proven right. Next, I finished Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman, and this is translated from the Dutch by Elizabeth Manton and Erica Moore. So this is a nonfiction book that is kind of not even reframing, because we've had the data for a while, but like looking at human history and this assumption that a lot of people have that most people are at heart selfish, and that we have to fight our natural instinct to be cruel to people, and that humanity in general is just like the worst. And so this book really like looks at history again. It looks at some very famous examples that supposedly like prove that theory, like the Milgram shock experiment, the Stanford prison trial, things like that, like the bystander effect, all of these like famous experiments or studies that supposedly prove that humans are selfish all the time, and actually they don't. And we have had this data, like I said, for several decades at least, and it's just so contrary to what people think about humanity that we don't pay attention to what the information actually says. I also want to make a correction, because I think in my TBR I said that this book includes like the real story that Lord of the Flies was based on, which had a completely different outcome than the novel. And actually because the back of the book calls it the real life Lord of the Flies, I assumed that meant it was a real story that the novel was based on, and actually it's just similar circumstances that turned out completely differently. So like it wasn't connected to the novel, but thematically it is connected. So just wanted to make that correction. But I thought this was fantastic. I think the author does a really good job of like acknowledging that humans can do really horrible things to each other, and he talks about some of those examples. Again, check content warnings if you need to. So he does acknowledge the horrible things that humanity has done, but he also explores that on balance, people are much more good than bad. Most people are good, and there's like all of this piles and piles and piles of data that proves that, but we don't think of that as the truth because it just goes against what we've been taught to believe. Like he talks about like Hobbes and Rousseau a lot, and like that whole argument that is still happening. And it's really interesting too because people who have a pessimistic view of people are considered realists, and people who are more optimistic or who believe that most people are good are like silly idealists. And it's like, actually the people who are going off of what data actually says are the people who are more positive about humanity. And again, he does talk about the bad stuff as well. He does acknowledge when there is a little bit of truth, but like most of these famous examples have a completely different outcome or conclusion than what we thought of. And those were some of my favorite parts of this book, is when he's taking these famous experiments and examples and studies and debunking them. I just thought that was a really compelling and interesting part of the book. I like the writing. I think that Bregman and the translators, it's written like very much like a narrative. I think it's very gripping. It's like a page turner, you know, of a nonfiction book, which is always, I think, exciting. I think he did a really good job of making his points and defending his points, and then kind of addressing, like I think he did a good job of anticipating when he would like make a point, and then if as the reader you're kind of like, okay, but wait, how would that work with this other thing that you had talked about? And then the next section he would talk about that. Like I think the flow of this worked really well. There were some parts in the middle that I found less compelling. They were more about like management and business, and they were still interesting and important, but just I think less interesting to me personally than some of the other chapters. But as a whole, I did really enjoy this book. I also think the end was really good. Like he talks about the Christmas truce of 1914, which I knew about, but he also talks about some kind of thematically similar examples that I did not know about. And again, just so much of this information is out there and people just don't know it, myself included on a lot of this, because it just goes against our instinct, which we've like trained ourselves to think that humans are usually terrible. And that's not the case actually. And I just think this is a really like galvanizing kind of book, because he also makes the point, which I very much agree with, that being a pessimist is the easy way out. Because if you believe that humans are basically cruel and selfish and awful, then it kind of feels like, well, what's the point of me trying to do good, trying to make the world better, trying to be a better person? I'm fighting a losing battle, so it doesn't really matter. Whereas if you believe that people are basically good, you look at the world and all of the problems in it and you want to do something about it, because it's like, how can people be good, but then we create these horrible systems and institutions and like do these horrible things. It's like when you believe that people are good, you want to make the world good, and you believe that you can, and that like that means something, that makes a difference. And again, it's not silly idealism, because this knowledge has a real impact and it is supported by data. And like I said, I think he also does a really good job of being upfront about sometimes the examples he uses where there is a grain of truth to them. Like I think he did a good job of acknowledging that, like obviously sticking to his larger point and showing that the vast majority of the evidence points to his point. But he does still talk about other information as well. I have been like raving about this book, but I did have a few issues with it. One is that I would like to see him talk more about how some recent events, like how those fit into his idea. And I know this was written, I think, in 2019. So for example, like when he's talking, he does talk about, I think, police violence very briefly, but I would have liked to see him address a little bit more like the incredibly high rate of police violence, especially against like killing unarmed Black men. And obviously those things have been happening for years. People have been talking about them for years, and obviously people are talking about that a lot more after 2020 and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor as well. It's not always Black men. So like obviously those things are, I think, even more on people's minds than even just a few years ago, but those things have been happening for a while and people have been talking about them for a while, and I would have liked to see kind of a little more discussion of that or acknowledgement of that. I also would have liked to see him acknowledge other factors that might make people less willing to help somebody or to go over and see if they needed help. Like for example, if you are a young woman by yourself, you might not want to stop at a car by the side of the road because you might get attacked, you know? So that kind of thing. And also there were some of his like suggestions or examples that I found like I wasn't quite on board with. Like there's a chapter where he talks about schools, and like definitely the school system in general needs to be changed. I obviously am most familiar with the American school system. There's a lot of problems with it, but I don't personally think the answer is like completely running a school based on what kids are interested in. I think a lot of it should be interest focused, but for example, you still need to learn math, you still need to learn world history, like even if kids are not as excited about it as their like passion projects or like the things they're interested in. Like you still need to have some stuff that you learn because it's important. So I just wish he would have acknowledged that. I don't know if maybe those schools are more of a hybrid system and he just didn't mention that, but that was like one example. I'm like, I'm not completely on board with this. Overall though, I thought this was a fantastic book. I don't think it's exaggerating to call this book like a game changer. Like if more people knew about the things in this book, I think that would be huge. Like I think that would have a positive impact on just about every aspect of human life. And I gave Humankind 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Lovesick Braves by Pamela Sanderson. This is the second book in the Crooked Rock romance series, which is a series of companion novels. And I read this as part of the Indigenous Romance Read-Along that Michelle from Thor Wants Another Letter and Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany are co-hosting. They brought it back to continue one of the series that they started as part of the read-along. So our two leads in this book are Esther and Theo. Esther, we know from the first book, she works at the Crooked Rock Urban Indian Center, and she's kind of trying to figure out what she, like if this is actually what she wants to do. And then our male lead is Theo, and he is really, he's really struggling. He's working like a ton of different jobs to try and pay for school so that he can finish his degree. He doesn't really have time for relationships, but of course he and Esther meet and they really like each other, but they both have reasons for not wanting to get caught up in this now, especially Theo. So we're following their individual growth, their romance obviously, and we also see more about the Urban Indian Center. Like there's a lot of stuff about like funding and like a building deal, and we're seeing that aspect of the plot develop as well from the first book. This series definitely is one that you should read in order because there are quite a few plot points that carry over, and I really enjoyed this overall. I think the fact that I gave this book 4 stars, I'll tell you right now, and I enjoyed it so much despite the fact that the romance itself didn't do much for me, I think is a testament to how good everything else in the book was. I really liked Esther and Theo as individual characters. I found their stories very compelling. Esther is also dealing with a really horrible roommate situation that was incredibly stressful to read about, but it was very well written. Like I just really felt for both of them, and I think thematically this series continues to do really interesting things. It talks a lot about the different support that Native American people who live in cities need as opposed to those living on reservations. It talks a lot about Native identity and also like microaggressions and assumptions people make about Native people. Also, I think in the first book we didn't know what like nation the characters were from, but in this one we do know that Esther is Shoshone and Theo is Apache, and the author is a citizen of the Karuk tribe. I also really like the writing of this series. Like I really like the humor, and I think that Pamela Sanderson does like group dynamics and friendship dynamics really, really well. I did not love the writing of the sex scenes. I know that some people didn't like the way the ones in the first book were done, but I actually thought those were good. They are more fade to black, but I thought they were written much better. This book I think did not do a great job with those. I also really liked the plot of this book. Like I said a couple times that I am way more invested in like the Urban Indian Center, like getting their funding and their building and everything. I'm way more invested in that than in Theo and Esther's romance. And then like I said, my biggest issue was like the romance itself. Like I just didn't care about it very much, honestly. Like by the end I was like, yeah, I want Esther and Theo to work things out. You're nice people. But it was a very distant feeling. I also don't tend to find it super interesting when a romance starts with either one character interested way more than the other, or both characters are interested but they just don't know it. Like, I mean, I said in my Goodreads review, you can tell that hate to love is usually one of my go-to tropes because I just don't find it interesting when they start out really liking each other already. So yeah, the romance wasn't my favorite, but also when I looked at the premise for all of the books, this was the one that interested me least. So considering I gave that book 4 stars, like this book 4 stars, I think that speaks pretty highly for the series overall. I'm excited to continue, especially because I already really like Tommy and he's going to be the male lead of the 3rd book. So yeah, 4 stars, happy to continue the series. Next, I finished The Book of Will by Lauren Gunderson. I mentioned in my previous wrap-up, like the first part of my November wrap-up, that I read a play I really didn't like from her, which I review in that video, but then I also read one I really loved, which is this one. So we are following basically a group of William Shakespeare's friends and colleagues who after his death decide to collaborate and put together a collected work of his plays, which like that was almost unheard of at this time. Like it's hard to explain what a big deal that was because now we would think that's a very obvious thing to do when a writer passes away, is to like collect their work, but people didn't do that for playwrights. Like that wasn't really a thing. Very few people had done that, and so it's about them, these group of friends like getting together and wanting to do this for him and for his work and for what it meant to all of them, and it is so beautiful. Like I am a Shakespeare lover, so obviously the aspects about him and his work and the power of his plays, obviously those resonated with me a lot, but I think even if you are like more indifferent to Shakespeare, I think you could still really love this play because it's also just about like memory, like remembering people and like what a legacy is, and grief. There's a lot about grief and like losing people and how you go on. There's a lot about love, like many different kinds of love. I think the characters are so rich and full and real. The relationships between them are so interesting. I think the dialogue is great. There are so many like this book deals with some like obviously, you know, heavy ideas, but there's a lot of humor. It is so funny. And I think it's also really impressive that this is one of those historical plays where we know the ending. Like we know that they collect Shakespeare's work, but I was kind of still on the edge of my seat, like waiting to see if they could do it or how they could do it. And something that is also noteworthy about this one is this play made me cry. And even though you guys know I cry a lot, it's actually very rare for me to cry when I'm just reading a play versus seeing it. So yeah, the emotional payoff was definitely there with this one, and I just loved it. Like the things it says too about like the importance of theater and like storytelling and what stories do for us. I loved it. This is like a Kara play, and I loved it. Also, as far as the writing, I think the play did a really excellent job of keeping kind of a Shakespearean flavor to it while not being overwhelming. Like if you don't read a lot of Shakespeare, I think you could still follow this play, but it also doesn't feel like just modern words slapped onto a historical setting. Obviously, I gave The Book of Will 5 stars. Next, I finished The Sherwood Ring by Elizabeth Marie Pope. This is a book I've been meaning to read for years and years, and I kept thinking it was a fall book and I wanted to read it in the fall, and then I didn't get to it. So I finally read it this fall, and I mostly did really enjoy this. So we're following Peggy Graham as our main character, and her father dies at the very beginning of the book, and she's an orphan now. Her mother had already died, so she ends up going to stay with, I think, like her uncle or like her great uncle or something. Yeah, her uncle, who lives on this like estate called Rest and Be Thankful, and he's very eccentric and very like fixated on their like family history, because they have some like important family history and like family ties to the American Revolution. And when Peggy's father was on his deathbed, he's like, oh, and if you see the ghosts, don't tell your uncle because he'll be jealous. And Peggy's reaction is kind of like, what? Like there's like a meme it makes me think of that I'm gonna put up a picture. But anyway, so she gets there, and unsurprisingly, she does in fact see these ghosts. And a lot of the book is actually her talking to these different ghosts and hearing about their stories. And you guys know I don't usually like flashbacks, but those were my favorite parts of the book. I loved them. I loved the ghost characters. They were really interesting, and their backstories were really interesting. And the way that as you go throughout the book, you start figuring out like what Peggy's family history is, how these characters relate to each other, and there's also kind of a present day mystery as well, because there's this young man that Peggy meets named Pat, I think, who's British, and he's here to do some research, and her uncle inexplicably hates him, even though they had made plans that Pat was going to come here and do some research. Now her uncle hates him and like kicked him out of the house, and nobody knows why. And so there's also some story about that. And yeah, I did really enjoy this. This was going to be a 4-star for most of the book, and then at the very, very end, there was just one too many pushy men in this book for me, and kind of out of nowhere, and it really irritated me. And the reason, there's like another character who's very kind of like high-handed, but he bothered me a lot less because his love interest was so great and she just like gave it right back to him. Like there's one scene in particular between them that I love, and I feel like that scene did a really good job of showing how like, yeah, he's really cocky, but like she can hold her own. Like it's not like an unequal relationship thing. But there was this other character who very unexpectedly got very bossy at the end, and not in a charming way. I think it was supposed to be charming, and I did not find it that way at all. I know this is like a somewhat older book, but that still bugged me. But overall, I did have a good time with this. It's also just like very cozy. Yeah, I just really enjoyed this. I liked the historical aspects. Again, I loved the ghost characters and their dynamics. I will say I was a little disappointed that there was no like ghost boyfriend trope, because I guess from the synopsis I had assumed that like it hints at a romantic relationship for Peggy as well. There's like 3 different romances in this book, and I had assumed based on the synopsis that it was gonna be her and like a ghost boyfriend. like a ghost romance trope, which I obviously love, and that's not what happened. So that might also have been a reason I was disappointed, but I did have fun with this. I would recommend it, and I gave The Sherwood Ring 3.75 stars. Next, I finished Verdigris Deep by Frances Hardinge. This was as part of me and Hannah's Frances Hardinge read-along. I will link that live show down below. This is Frances Hardinge's only contemporary fantasy, I think. Like, most of it is very contemporary, but there is a fantastical element. Our main character is a boy named Ryan, and he and his friends Josh and Shell, at the beginning of the book, end up taking some coins from a wishing well. and that goes very badly. Now they have to serve the Witch of the Well and grant wishes, and then as the book goes on, they start developing these strange powers and abilities, but they also start realizing, especially Ryan and Shell start realizing that things are not right with this, that these wishes are becoming very dangerous, and I really, really love this one. I think the blend of fantasy and contemporary is really good. I also think it's interesting because this definitely still feels like Frances Hardinge's obviously own writing style, but I think it's interesting that she it feels more grounded than I think her books usually do. It's a little bit less flowery and a little bit less fantastical, while still having very rich descriptions. I loved the characterization. Like, Hannah and I talked during our live show, like we both just love Ryan and Shell so much. Like they are just so good and so pure, and we just want to protect them from all harm. And I think this book did a phenomenal job of showing how complicated kids' friendships can be. Like, yeah, they're young, but kids still have these very like complex dynamics, and like you really understand why Ryan and Shell would stay in this friend group that often makes them unhappy. I think the well and like the well spirit, and like the wishes and all of that was really, really interesting. I think the atmosphere is really good in this book. I have talked before, there's like a very particular scene that I remembered for 5 years because it is so well written and so chilling, but like not in a super creepy way. Like you guys know I don't really do horror very much, or hardly at all, and it still was like it was like creepy in an enjoyable way, not like over the top for me. I also loved the way that the adults were written, especially some of the parents. Like Ryan's parents are such richly developed characters, especially his mother. And Frances Hardinge really plays with your expectations on like certain tropes or certain expectations we have about the parents in middle grade books, and I just think that was really well done. Yeah, I loved this. I do know that the start can be a little bit slow for some people, which I definitely understand, but I really love this one, and especially like once you get past like the introductory part, it's like I could not put this book down. I meant to kind of just read it at my own pace, you know, see what happened, and I think I finished it in like 2 sittings. I loved it. I gave Verdigris Deep 5 stars. I don't know that I mentioned this, but this was actually a reread for me, and I gave it 5 stars both times. Next, I finished Yusuf Azeem Is Not a Hero by Sadia Faruqi. This is a contemporary novel that is set actually this year in 2021, and it's specifically set around the time of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And speaking of timing, there was a big chunk of this book where I assumed that this was taking place kind of in an alternate universe where COVID wasn't a thing, but then there's like a few references to it later on, so I realized it's kind of like an alternate universe where COVID did happen, but people followed directions and had basic common sense and compassion, and there was vaccine equity, and we beat COVID in a reasonable amount of time. But it makes sense considering the time that Sadia Faruqi must have finished writing this book, but I did just want to mention that. And yeah, so this follows our main character Yusuf, and this takes place again around the time of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and the Islamophobia towards him and his family, some of his community members, is becoming even worse because of the timing. So Yusuf is dealing with that. He also, one of his uncles gives him his journal to read from when he was Yusuf's age, because he actually was Yusuf's age when 9/11 happened. And so he gives him this journal because Yusuf starts asking about 9/11 and like, what is this, like, never forget? Like, what does that mean? What happened? Because like they knew about it a little in school, but it's not as immediate as it was for other people, and so his uncle gives him his journal to kind of help him understand. So we see that's a part of the book as well, and I thought those journal entries did really add a lot to the story. Yusuf is also really excited because he wants to participate in a robotics competition. He really loves like robots and like programming and everything. There's also some like interesting friendship things, and I thought this book was really, really well done. One thing that was just interesting as far as like a perspective is, this is so silly, but I did not think about how there are so many kids who have to be taught about 9/11 in schools for the first time. Like, not that Yusuf was taught about it for the first time, because he does know about it before this, but like I was very young when 9/11 happened, but I did grow up knowing about it, and like I was alive when it happened. And so it was really interesting reading about kids who did not have, like, don't remember it at all. And again, I was very young when it happened, but I do have some memories around that time. And so like just that perspective I think was another really interesting layer to this book. I loved Yusuf as a character. He is just like so smart and brave and loving. I love his relationship with his family, especially with his baby sister, and with his mother. I loved the family dynamics. I loved the themes about like bravery and heroism and tolerance. I also love like the explanation, like when we understand what the title means or what it refers to. I really love that. I thought some of the friendship stuff was really interesting. I thought the robotics was an interesting element. Yeah, like I really enjoyed this. My only, I guess, issue is that there were some of the plot points where I feel like the timing or the flow of those felt a little bit off. Like didn't quite like flow together as well. But overall, I thought this was really great, and I gave Yusuf Azeem Is Not a Hero 4.5 stars. Next, I finished A Pendant for Trouble by Rosalie Oakes. This is a prequel novella in I think it's the Lady Jewel Diviner series, and I basically read this so that I could pick up the first full-length novel. We're following our main character Eleanor, and she has the ability to divine jewels. So she can like tell where jewels are, like she can sense them and find them. And she's actually at a garden party where this happens, very inconveniently. And so then she's trying to figure out whose jewel this is. There's also a possibility that it could be used for some kind of spell that might not have the best outcome or consequences. So it's about kind of that mystery, and also like about some of these character relationships. Like she also has a crush on this man named Lord Beresford, I think. I read this as an ebook, so I can't remember. And yeah, I liked this. This was, again, very short. It really is just like a setup, I think, for the main novel. I liked the writing. I liked the characterizations. I think the magic is interesting. I wasn't super sold on the romance. I think there's like an interesting scene or two of them near the end, and I am excited to see where things go in the rest of the series. But again, I don't tend to like romances that like start before the book, or like romantic interest even that starts before the book, because we start out with Eleanor already being kind of in love with Lord Beresford, and I just wish we had gotten development for that or set up, because I just wasn't invested in their relationship. But again, I'm excited for the rest of the series. I anticipate enjoying that a lot more, and I gave A Pendant for Trouble 3.75 stars. And finally, the last book I finished in November was Burning Bright by Melissa McShane. This is the first book in the Extraordinaries series, which is a series of like historical fantasy, kind of like alternate historical fantasy novels. And Melissa McShane is an author who I've been wanting to try for a very, very long time. I've had a feeling that I was really gonna love her. So the fact that I loved the first book I read from her makes me feel pretty good. I think this was a recommendation from Tatiana Night Owl, actually, who I will link below. She's great. Yeah, so our main character is actually also named Eleanor. When I was like planning this video, I actually had to double check, because I'm like, am I just misremembering? But no, I happened to read 2 books with a main character named Eleanor right after each other, so that was interesting. But yeah, so Eleanor is an extraordinary, and this is an alternate like fantasy version of 1812 in England. And I think it's not just like historical but with magic. I think it actually is alternate history in some ways, because as far as I can tell, the War of 1812 is like not happening, and I think it's like an alternate history where the American colonies never gained independence, because they talk about like the colonial fleet helping Britain against Napoleon, because this is set during the Napoleonic Wars. And like the magical aspect is there are people in this world who have various kinds of magic abilities. Like there's I think 8 different talents that people can have. And then there are very, very rare people who are extraordinaries in these different talents. And the way that that works is you are not only very, very powerful at those particular, like that particular ability, but you also have like an added dimension to that ability. So for example, like there are people called shapers. They can change their own facial appearance, and they can heal their own body. But if you're an extraordinary shaper, you're called a healer, because you can do that on other people. And then Eleanor is not just a scorcher, which obviously they use fire, they can set fires, but Eleanor is also an extraordinary scorcher. And what that means is not only does she have very, very powerful fire abilities, but she can actually put fires out, which nobody else can do. She's the first extraordinary scorcher in England in like 100 years or something. And so when she is threatened with getting pushed into a horrible marriage that she doesn't want, she just goes off to the Navy and enlists. She manages to convince them, like the Navy, that she will be an asset in their fight against Napoleon, and specifically these like pirates that are helping him, or that are like also attacking England. So she manages to get a place on this ship, and the captain is Miles Ramsey, and he is not necessarily thrilled that she's there. He thinks it's a good idea to use her abilities, but like they both have reasons for being a little less than enthusiastic about like the timing, and like basically they need her help, but things are very complicated, and she's also the only woman on the ship, and some of the men are really not happy about that. But then we get to see when Eleanor finally starts using her abilities and like showing them what she can do, people start coming around, which that was just one thing I loved. Is it is incredibly satisfying to see a woman just like set things on fire. What I mean is that it's very satisfying to see in this very like restricted time period to see a female character who is so competent and so strong and so powerful, and just like seeing the awe on these male characters' faces is just very enjoyable and very entertaining. So yeah, I love this. I really love the writing. I think Melissa McShane does a really great job of giving you like the setting and like the characterization detail and all of that. Like I don't know, she's one of those writers where like she's just very clearly good at what she does. I think all of the elements of the story are balanced really well. I loved Eleanor as a main character so much. Like she is so determined and brave. Like she's just such a wonderful character because she's not one of those stereotypical strong female characters, even though she is very strong, she has this very impressive ability. She's also just very complex. She, like for example, she likes wearing dresses. It's also really interesting to see throughout the book her kind of trying to come to terms with the fact that her actions do kill people. That yeah, she's fighting like the bad guys, but she has to recognize the fact that like she does end people's lives. And it's interesting because at first I thought that maybe wasn't going to get touched on as much, but we see that really catch up to her later, which was really interesting. I really loved Miles as a character. This book also has a really, really, really good slow burn romance. I loved it so much. And I think I remember seeing people say that like this book, like the romance in this book specifically, is like if you were like interested in the Norbeth ship from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, you might enjoy this one. And I can definitely see why people would say that. I would add that if you're not into that, you could still really enjoy this. It's not like a requirement, but I see why people made that comparison. I also think the magic aspects are super interesting. I thought the plot was very compelling. Like so much of this book takes place on a ship, and y'all know I don't like ship books, but I loved this. Like I just really enjoyed the story and the characters. I also think, I've said this a few times with historical fantasy I've read, so I'm realizing that this is like one of the things I really love about historical fantasy is seeing how magic affects things like class and gender, and like the historical, I don't know, setting, milieu, but also like how it does change those things, but also the time period does still matter. And kind of related to that, I appreciated the fact that because Eleanor has such an amazing power at her disposal, it felt a little bit safer following her. Like there's still reasons that she is concerned about being attacked or being assaulted. Like unfortunately patriarchy is still a fact in this world, and violence against women is still a fact and a threat in this world. But because of Eleanor's abilities, I feel like that there was a little bit more safety, and it was just kind of nice to read a book where you felt like, okay, the main character probably could defend herself though, set someone on fire. So I appreciated that too. Yeah, I just really loved this. This is the book that I said in my Goodreads review that I stayed up way too late finishing this one, despite the fact that I had to work early the next morning because I just could not stop reading it. I loved it, and I gave Burning Bright 5 stars.